Hello and good day, friends. I hope you all had a wonderful weekend. I welcome you once again to the Enqueue Sports YouTube channel. Now today, without any delay, we are going to move on to our topic, which is the evolution of the racket. Now rackets can be used in several sports: tennis and squash, badminton and table tennis. We are going to be discussing the forefather of all these rackets, which is the tennis racket, which probably looks somewhat like this, the modern day racket. Now, how did this racket initially evolve? This is a tennis racket. Tennis was first played in the 11th century by French monks, and as it is written in the history books, the rackets back then used to be made up of flesh. Now, some say it was human flesh, some say it was something else, but it was something similar to flesh. But as time evolved, there was a lot of little innovations that went into the sport back then. Now, back in the 12th century or the 13th century era, wooden rackets were made. The tennis rackets were made wooden, completely wooden. That was one step to the next level as far as the racket sports were concerned. And as the time went by, around about the 14th century and the 15th century era, the squash rackets were discovered. And the squash rackets, which the modern day squash rackets look somewhat like this, these are known to be the grandchildren of this tennis racket, because this squash racket was obviously modeled upon the model of a tennis racket. Now, how was it modeled upon a tennis racket? The lengths of both these rackets are pretty much the same, just a difference of 1 or 2 inches in length. The heads are different. The tennis racket has a roundish head, which can be somewhere between 95 inches to 105 inches for the adult size rackets. And if you look at the squash racket, it is ovalish in shape. So the squash rackets initially were also made with pure wood. And having said that, the pure wood and the frames attached to the pure wood and the gutting that used to be done on these were obviously not up to the mark. Players used to struggle with the shock absorption things, and it used to hurt. And there wasn't enough flexibility. There wasn't enough stiffness in the rackets. Now, just a brief look into the past. When squash was initially started, it wasn't played with this particular racket. It used to be played with these balls. This is a standard squash ball, the modern day ball. It didn't used to look similar to this, but it used to look pretty much the same. Now, what they used to do back in the day, they used to smash these balls with their hand, and the ball would go and hit a net, a big, huge net, and rebound. And then again, they would keep on hitting the ball with their palms. And by the end of the games, their palms used to get really swollen up, and it used to hurt. Then later on, they started putting some sort of a webbing between the hands, and with that, the pain slightly diminished, not altogether. Then came the wooden rackets, as I told you, and the technology kept on evolving until 1887. Wooden rackets were the norm. But after 1887, the rackets, these rackets, tennis rackets or squash rackets, started to get made up of metal or metallic materials. They used to be extremely hard, heavyweight, and stiffness used to be an issue. But it wasn't until the 1970s, because in 1967 Wilson came up with the T2000 racket, which was made up of a metal, a pure metal. And Jimmy Connor, a very famous player, used to play with that particular racket back in the day. Then after that, as time passed by, round about the late 1970s era, a person by the name of Howard Head, who also later on became the founder and owner of this particular company known as Head Sports. Now, who was he? He used to work for Prince. Now, Prince is another racket sport company, a very famous and renowned company. He used to work for Prince, and he came up with a lot of innovations, tremendous innovations. The greatest one being the aluminum racket. Now, the aluminum racket reduced the weight of the rackets and gave slight more, you could say, stiffness to the racket, which was the demand of the players back then. Even now, players demand stiffer rackets. And consequently, once again, the supergiant Wilson Sports came up with a racket which was slightly thicker in gauge, which made the stiffness level go up without increasing the weight. And that racket was a huge super hit. And almost all the players back then used to use that particular racket. As the time evolved, as the innovations came into place, in the 1980s, carbon graphite was another material that was introduced into the racket sports. Now, what was the carbon fiber? Carbon fiber, or carbon graphite as you call it, is this sort of a material. You know, if you just knock it, you're going to feel that it's empty from the inside. Now, what happens with this carbon graphite racket? It has no weight. It is literally, you can't call it weightless, but it's very light in weight. And the stiffness factor is covered in it as well. So in the 1980s, the carbon graphite came into effect. Now, one thing I would like to add here is this graphite used in the manufacturing of rackets is not the same graphite that is used in the pencils. I hope you get what I mean. So it is made up of carbon fibers or carbon filaments of carbon joined together to make this a perfect racket. Now, time passed and a lot of players came and went, and a lot of companies evolved with the passage of time as well. This particular brand, known as Babolat, evolved later on as well, which is obviously the preferred brand of one of the greatest tennis players of all time, Rafael Nadal. And it's not that Babolat only manufactures carbon fiber rackets or carbon graphite rackets. They also manufacture other variations. They manufacture many other variations. They can manufacture aluminum rackets as well, titanium rackets as well, and several other metals or ceramic materials are used in the manufacturing of the rackets as well. Then if we talk about the supergiant Wilson, of course. Now, Wilson is the brand that is the pioneer of rackets, as discussed earlier. This is a tennis racket made by Wilson, and this is a squash racket made by Wilson. Now, a lot of innovation goes into these rackets. The tennis racket obviously has to strung up. You have to put the strings inside the racket, inside the frames of the racket, and the same is the case with the squash racket as well. For the tennis racket, the stringing has to be, the tension in the strings has to be somewhat between 45 to 60 pounds. Whereas in this squash racket, it can be somewhere like 26 pounds, 28 pounds, 27 or 29 pounds, depending on the player's preferences. So, if you look at the lengths of the rackets, there are some, this racket can be, the tennis racket can be 27 to 29 inches. This one is almost, if you see, it's almost the same size, but it can sometimes be a couple of inches shorter. Longer and oversized rackets have also been made in the past and in the current era as well, and so are the shorter sized rackets. Now, if you have a look at the shorter sized rackets, they'll probably look like these, like this one in your picture right now. This is a short sized racket. This is mostly used by youth tennis players or tennis players under the age of 16. If you compare the adult racket with the youth racket, you're going to see that the head size is pretty much the same. It can vary between 95 to 105 inches. And the main difference comes in the length. Now you can see clearly the youth racket is about a couple of inches or sometimes 3 inches shorter in length as compared to the adult size. So these are the few variations that kept on coming with the passage of time in the racket sports. Players came and went. Players used a lot of brands, but the best brands that were ever used by the various racket sports players were, of course, Wilson, as discussed earlier, babolat, head, and Prince also came into play, as I discussed earlier. And the Wilson rackets were used by a lot of legendary players. In squash, if you talk about squash, the Wilson racket was famously used by the great Jahangir Khan, who won 555 consecutive squash games for Pakistan. So he used this brand, Wilson. And with the, as I discussed earlier, Howard Head, who used to work for Prince back in the 1970s and 80s, came up with his own brand known as Head, which is a very, very famous brand. In tennis, it is nowadays used by Novak Djokovic, and this is a squash variation of the Head racket. These rackets have their specifications all embossed or written the inside part of the head. So the specifications include weight, balance, and head size. I'll just give you an example. If you look closely over here, this part here, it clearly tells you the weight, balance, and the head size. And this way, a tennis player or a squash player can easily choose his pick in these rackets. So the modern player has a lot of options and a lot of privileges when it comes to choosing a racket for any racket sport. But that wasn't the case in the days gone by. So this was it for today. In our upcoming episodes, we are definitely going to tell you about several other privileges that the modern day sportsman enjoys in various sports as compared to their forefathers or their predecessors. But for that purpose, you'll need to stay subscribed, keep supporting us, keep encouraging us, and keep giving your feedbacks, and also follow us on Instagram, like us on Facebook, and stay safe, everyone. Take care of yourself and your loved ones, and as usual, I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Until then, goodbye.
Outside.